Welcome to The Alchemist, and on today's episode, let's discuss Possessed Seven Churches and ask the question, is this the first death metal album? I'm making this a two-part series. Next Tuesday, I'm going to be covering Death, Scream, Bloody Gore and raising the same question. Often when people talk about the first death metal albums, these are the two albums that people are debating. I also set up a poll on the community section of the Layer of the Alchemist YouTube channel homepage. You can go there and you can vote for either of these two albums, or if you don't think either of these two albums is the first death metal album, you can vote that also and leave a comment on what you feel is the first death metal album. Well, you can't say I don't listen to all kinds of different music. Yesterday, I had a video on Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run, and here we are talking about Seven Churches from Possessed. This album was released on Combat. This is significant because Death, Scream, Bloody Gore was also released on Combat. Seven Churches was released on November 4th, 1985. Jeff Percara on bass and vocals, Mike Torreo on guitars, Larry Lalonde on guitars. Larry Lalonde will go on to play with Primus, and Mike Suss on drums. It's produced by Randy Burns and Barry Coburn. Randy Burns also produces Scream, Bloody Gore. So there's already some connections right out of the gate. Possessed Seven Churches was released before Scream Bloody Gore, so it's real easy to hear the influence that this album had on Chuck Schuldiner and on that first Death record. I listened to both of these albums back to back, and then I immediately sat down to make this video because I thought it would be interesting to just really hear them back to back and comparing the two. But we're here to talk about Seven Churches today, kind of towards the end here. Or I guess as we go along, I'll make the case for why you might consider this the first death metal record, or why you might not consider this the first death metal record. Now, I've made a few videos on death metal. Haven't made a lot of videos on death metal. And I made one with like my favorite death metal bands. I made another one why I'm not totally into death metal. Got a lot of comments on those, realized that I don't know as much about death metal as I never claimed to know a lot about death metal, because again, it's not a genre that it makes up a small part of my listening habits. So keep that in mind as we go through this. So I think the case for this is one of those records, and I'm going to, at the end here, go to the community poll and we'll see where that stands. I just put that up today as is the making of this video. And there are some comments on there that I think are really interesting that I want to read. This is one of those records where they're pushing the boundary of thrash, and I feel at times it does sort of tip into death metal. Again, how conscious is it? I think it's really just a case of, at this point in time with metal, bands it was a lot of one-upping the stuff that came before you. Can you play faster? Can you play more aggressive? Can you play harder? Can you play heavier? Can the vocals be more extreme? Can the riffing be more crazy? And everybody was kind of trying to one-up each other in this category. So I think here with Seven Churches, it is taking sort of that thrash template, but it's pushing it even more. And is it tipping over into death metal? Well, maybe. The vocals, Jeff Percara's vocals here are very aggressive. And again, they're not growling vocals, but they're pushing in that direction. You can see how I would say that this is a bridge between extreme thrash and death metal. Just like if you listen to like early Slayer, it's kind of taking the new wave of British heavy metal, speeding it up and moving it into the thrash world. And by the time they land at Rain and Blood, and they're fully now in the thrash mode, whereas maybe their very early stuff, you can still hear those new wave of British heavy metal influences. So you kind of get that on here through certain songs where you can hear them tipping their hat maybe to Venom or Slayer, and then at other times really pushing into new territory. The album opens with The Exorcist, which is kind of a cool little keyboard thing, a tubular bells take off, influenced by the movie The Exorcist. Pentagram, fast, evil riffing all over that. Burning in Hell, to me, is very Venom-like in the vocals. The angular single-note riffs between the verses are very, very cool. They just kind of like, they just sort of jump out at you. I think that's awesome. Evil Warriors. I love the halftime middle section, and this is where you can really start to hear where Death takes their influence, and that section right there really jumps out at me as like, okay, Chuck heard that and sort of used that as a blueprint for Scream Bloody Gore. The title track, Seven Churches, very aggressive vocals and fast riffing. Love that modulating single note riff thing. Then it goes up. I talk about modes and stuff in a very recent video. You can check that out for when I make references to stuff like that. Holy Hell. This riffing for me is a little bit more thrash-like, so this leans a little bit more towards that older sound. Twisted Minds. I hear early Slayer in this, Haunting the Chapel. That very early Slayer, especially in that halftime section and in the guitar solos. Fallen Angel, I love the chimes and bells at the beginning of that. Kind of gives it an evil, doomish type sound, which of course I love. I've mentioned in other videos that I never really fully got into death metal. My big subgenre jump from traditional metal was into doom metal. And I was always I'd say I know more about black metal than I do about death metal. I've always been just very much on the surface with death metal. And the song Death Metal here at the end, it's maybe the most death metal sounding song on the record. Very aggressive, very unrelenting. In a lot of ways, if you listen to this is really the blueprint for what Chuck would do with Death and in Scream Bloody Gore. It reminds me of like the way Venom had a song called Black Metal, kind of hearkening like, okay, we're trying to move metal into a new direction. As I was listening to this too, and this is maybe a case that you would make for this not being the first death metal album, is the vocals aren't quite extreme enough, although they're moving in that direction. There are these nods to thrash, like I mentioned with Venom and Slayer at times. And I don't know if you really hear much blast or any real blast beats on this record. Now, I'm not a drummer, and again, I'm not a total death metal historian by any stretch. So maybe what my definition of blast beating is, there's definitely fast and aggressive drumming on here, but I don't know how often it really flips into blast beat territory, which I think on Scream Bloody Gore, the drums, even though they may not be full-blown blast beats, are moving closer to that. Okay, so that might be the argument for why it's not the first death metal record. The argument for why it is again, the over-the-top riffing. It definitely gets away from the Metallica, Megadeth style, Anthrax, that style of riffing that fits real firmly into what we would consider to be thrash metal. This starts to get real aggressive, really fast, and again, the vocals. Okay, so I did have a poll in the community section on the website. You can go there and you can vote, and I'm going to refresh it right here to see where we stand on this. I only put it up this morning, so we'll only have 58 votes at this point. We've got 31 for Seven Churches. We've got 64% that's 31% for Seven Churches, 64% for Scream Bloody Gore, and we have 5% for neither. All right, I thought there were some really interesting comments here. Blitzhammer says, in my unpopular opinion, Seven Churches is a thrash metal album. I do like this comment from Legend Maker 694, Death Leprosy. The debut was getting there, but it still had so much thrash in it that it sounds like a thrash death album. That's a really good point, that there's still enough thrash elements in both of those records. He says it still has a thrash death metal sound in retrospect. Leprosy still had plenty of thrash influences, but it's cemented a lot more of what would become death metal, the breakdowns, the proto, he puts that in question marks, blast beats. Again, I kind of feel the same way. Are we totally at blast beats yet? The tremolo riffs, the chaotic and often chromatic or dissonant Slayer-ish solos. The vocals are a bit closer to the characteristic death metal growl, although Chuck never mastered that part. And that's a good point, that Chuck's vocals did sort of change. Gustavo Sacafuro replies, it's clear to me that no band alone is responsible for any music genre by itself. It's something that starts in the unconscious collective of musicians and artists all around the world at the same time. I think that That's a really good point. I'm going to get back to that in a second. I want to read Greg Balzer. He says, even Chuck and Cam said Possessed were the first death metal band. Jeff from Possessed also claims that Possessed is death metal. That's a very good point. Chuck makes no bones about Possessed Seven Churches being a huge influence on him. And I do like that comment about nobody really starts it on their own. This is a good point because when people are making this music, they're not necessarily thinking I'm starting something called death metal. They're just pushing the boundaries like I discussed earlier. And they are trying to create something new, but it's in the sense of, well, we're just trying to push boundaries. We're trying to create our own sound. We're trying to take what came before us, but take it to the next level. This is also the same argument when people talk about like 70s hard rock. Is Led Zeppelin heavy metal? I say no, they're not heavy metal, but they're very influential on heavy metal. So it's easy to see how somebody from the outside might hear Led Zeppelin and say, oh yeah, they're heavy metal, because they had such an influence on heavy metal bands. Same thing with Deep Purple and Uriah Heep, UFO, Thin Lizzy. These are all bands that I don't consider to be metal, but there's no denying that they were very influential on metal. And you could say the same thing here with Possessed Seven Churches. Is it death metal, or is it just an album that was very influential on death metal? So, all right, there you go. Make sure you go over to the polls, because when I do the Death Scream Bloody Gore video, we'll take another look at the polls next week. So make sure you do that. Let me know in your comments down below about Possessed Seven Churches. What do you think of this record? How do you view it as far as that thrash death metal debate here? Let me know in the comments down below. Till we see you again, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.